Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. My name is Zihan Rashid. I'm representing Happy Strong Family. Thank you very much for coming on to our show today, which encompasses a very, I think, notable and very accomplished sister. Her name I'm going to introduce. I'm going to allow her to introduce herself, but I'm just going to briefly tell you what I have read, which I think is very impressive about her performance so far, her qualifications. Her name is Aasiyah Khan. She's an educational outreach department she is an with the Educational Outreach Department in the National Council of Canadian Muslims. Sorry, I'm mumbling my words. She'll tell you more about this council. She is qualified as a BSc in Psychology from the University of Toronto, and she has a Master's in Social Work from York Uni in University in Toronto also. I see that she has experiences of Muslim women. She did a research study with the main subject as Muslim women experiencing Islamophobia in the GTA and resilience that is associated with it. I see she had extensive experience with inclusion and anti-oppressive practice principles, etc. There's really so much I read here, which sounds like she's been in this field and at a young age. It really sounds a very impressive resume where she has visited 11 cities in Canada. She has trained over 5,000 educators, and she has talked about Islamophobia with them. We'll ask her what that has been. And she also has involved 3,500 students who may have some role to play as bystanders when something like an Islamophobic event takes place. And media literacy. She enjoys hiking. I was asking her if she enjoys biryani making, which she said no, she leaves that to the experts. But I see she's an expert in making chai, as she calls it, and she has traveled to places and loves friends and cultures. So, Aasiyah, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. We'd love your insight on what you've been doing, your own input, and a little bit about this organization called National Council of Canadian Muslims, which our audience may not necessarily know a lot about.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair for the kind introduction. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Aasiyah. I'm the Manager of Education Programs at the National Council of Canadian Muslims, NCCM. The NCCM is an independent, nonprofit human rights organization that works to challenge and disrupt Islamophobia across Canada. My primary role over the last 4.5 years has been working in the education sector. So looking at ways we can challenge Islamophobia with, educational practices, pedagogy. I also work really closely with communities. So if there are any issues within the school system, so parents often reach out with concerns around religious accommodations, bullying, alienation, we are able to provide support that way as well. And a huge chunk of our work involves training. So we recognize there's a huge knowledge gap. Educators know that religious accommodations are part of, our human rights, but they don't really necessarily know what that means. Like, what does it mean to set up a prayer room? What does that look like? What would religious accommodation look like during Ramadan? So these are some of the things that we provide training on, and also looking at how do we raise young people who are confident in their Muslim identity, young people who feel like they could practice their Muslimness within educational spaces is something that we look very closely at as well.
Thank you. That's an excellent introduction. Aasiyah, I've worked with the Muslim community also in a slightly different context. But this issue of Muslim young people being able to practice their Muslim identity, in particular, as you mentioned, prayer rooms, for example, or perhaps the issue of not being asked to mix with the opposite gender in certain activities, or not being, I wouldn't use the word forced because I don't think anybody is, but almost being made to feel awkward if they did not participate in things like the Christmas carols, for example, or other religious activities that clearly are, to my mind at least, they're almost a breach of their own worldview and their principles, which many youngsters may not even be aware of. I was going to ask you in this role of educating the educator, could you give us some idea what that involves? Because I have a feeling this is something that may be useful and I don't know, I'm sure you've done work within the GTA in this
Mhm.
context also. Could you elaborate a little bit about what this educator role is for the educators for us,
Mhm.
just so all of us can be a little bit more
Yeah,
enlightened?
for sure.
Thank you.
So in our work with educators, so we have major partnerships with all schools in the GTA. So we're very active at like TDSB, Peel, York Region. We train educators and also senior leaders. And the training involves looking at what Islamophobia is. It's very hard to disrupt something that you don't know. So we talk about what Islamophobia is, how it shows up within our spaces, and through some of that, we share what we've learned from our community. So our work is directly tied with the work that we've been doing in centering student voices. So one of the main things that I like to share is directly from students. And what they've been telling us is they're made to feel like they're a problem, that their Muslim identity somehow is in conflict with the way, the status quo, right? And that's and you could imagine what that might mean for an individual going into an education space. They're going to feel like they can't be who they are, right? So we had a number of students who said, I feel like I can't, I've changed my name. I've shortened my name, right?
Yeah.
Muhammad becomes Mo,
Yeah.
Bilal becomes Bill. Or, I don't want my friends to know I'm Muslim. So I asked my someone actually told me this last spring. It's a 10-year-old who said, my mom wears a hijab. So I asked her to not actually come to pick me up from school because I don't want my friends to know I'm Muslim. And so when we think about what this means, really we need to reflect on how is our education set up, right? Why is it that Muslim students aren't feeling like they're welcome? And I think it relates to kind of broader issues around like Islamophobia, right? There's an entire industry, and I know Dr. Rashid, you're very read as well on this, but there's an entire industry. Like Islamophobia is not by fluke, right? It's very intentional, and so it'd be very silly for us to assume that our schools are somehow incubated from these issues, right? And so they're very much alive within our spaces. So our training really does center the student experience. It also goes through some very like active case studies. So we look at, if something's happening in your classroom, what can you actually do? What does it look like? And I think we end with some resources. We also remind folks that they can reach out to NCCM. Again, most school boards ask for a number of trainings throughout the school year because they recognize how prevalent Islamophobia is within these spaces.
Just for a definition for our audience and for myself, what would be an average description of Islamophobia? So if you could give me maybe a couple of examples. One of them could, of course, be like you mentioned, the difficulty with the hijab, for example,
Yes.
or the name calling behind somebody who has dressed differently from you. Because I know several people younger, I'm talking about 10 years ago almost, where they were made to feel that if they did not follow the trends, or if they questioned what was being done, that they were somehow weird, and they were made to feel like they have come from somewhere where they need to learn. I still remember somebody saying, when did you arrive in Canada?
Right.
And this sister was not just born in Canada, she actually never been outside Canada at all. So she found it very offensive.
Yes.
But she also didn't know how to defend or how to at least approach this matter.
Right.
Because I remember her saying that her teacher also had that kind of, not necessarily a direct, but almost an implicit attitude to say, well, you're being treated like this because you behave like this. So it's almost like there is something therefore the matter with you that provokes such a response from your other students. So I just wanted your insight into how you have found Islamophobia and what would you define this word as, just for all of us to be a little bit.
Very, very good question. One thing that sticks out to me is a 2017 study by the Angus Reid Institute, where they actually surveyed Canadians and their attitudes. And we often don't think about attitudes, right? We look at actions, we look at behaviors, but there's a very close link between attitude and action. And 46% of Canadians noted that they had an unfavorable view of Islam. So there is a huge a gap in understanding and knowledge. And so the way it's translating into schools in terms of Islamophobia and those experiences. So as we mentioned hijab, obviously a lot of Muslim students are coming into school feeling like they have to be the voice of all Muslims at all times. So something's happening in another part of the world. They have nothing to do with it, but they come into school Monday morning and they know they have to be prepared to answer questions on about 1.8 billion Muslims around the world, right? So it's a huge burden, and you could imagine what that means for mental health and well-being as well for a student. The other way that we're finding is curriculum. There's a part in our student workshops where I ask students, do you remember a time when you felt meaningfully represented in classroom learning? And of course, depending on who's in the audience, I often get crickets, right? And as a facilitator, you're like, what does this mean? And we kind of unpack that. And many students share, like, especially Muslim students, say, I've never been meaningfully represented. You know, when I am represented, it's under, negative presumptions. It's a negative event that we're talking about, but never am I talked about in my Muslim identity as a positive force. So curriculum is a huge space where we're finding Islamophobia show up. And for an educator to be able to actually recognize curriculum as Islamophobic requires training. Because currently, I've even seen mainstream textbooks that have Islamophobic content in it. And many schools use them. So if they don't have that lens, they're not intentional about what they're teaching and how they're teaching, it's very easy for us to fall into this cycle where Islamophobia does become the status quo.
Very good. What are your thoughts on specific acts of bullying or what would be termed really as a racist event?
Yes.
I know that I've had these events reported indirectly. Because I teach at an evening school. I also have a participation in the mosques, 2 or 3 mosques in the east end of Toronto. And I know that students ask these questions, particularly around holidays. So, when for example, the October time comes in, the Halloween holiday, for example, or the winter holidays that come up to say, children ask them about why don't you participate and what have you got against, and questions of that nature, which I still think, Sister Aasiyah, has a lot to do with our own, I think, home environments not really being conducive to a child's Muslim identity. So I don't personally think that this can all just be like a buck passing exercise to say, well, it's all outside. I believe a lot of it is inside, where we are not utilizing the time we have as parents, as grandparents, as educators, as people who take this seriously, to say we actually have, I wouldn't like to use the word obligation, but we have some kind of responsibility to educate where we live. After all, we have a street. We have surely neighbors that we know more closely. We have a workspace. We have the opportunity in Ramadan, for example, where we can pass around gifts to our neighbors. We have an opportunity, again, around the Eid times, where people can become a little bit familiar rather than wait for another event like Quebec City or London or what happened at IMO here in Toronto. What are your thoughts on that? How can we, before we go on to the wider Canadian community, how about the Canadian Islamic community? What education can we, as people who are interested in this matter, how can we improve their understanding to say, guys, you are not sitting ducks, you're not helpless. There's 1 million plus Muslims living in Canada. Why is it necessary for just the National Canadian Council Muslims to come and show us, hey, this is a country where you've adopted, either you were born here or you've adopted this as your home. So how have you educated people that live around you, around the mosques? For example, this mosque right here, we have a huge community of people that are not Muslims around here. I take it upon myself. I don't live locally, but I do think that we also have many opportunities which we have not quite, I think, utilized the way we could. Some of us lived here. I've lived in Canada for almost 20 years. That's a huge time chunk. That's almost, quarter of a century. What are your thoughts on that? How can we educate our Muslim community, Muslim Canadian community, to become a little bit more dynamic in the education part of the wider community, rather than leaving it to just, some, mashallah, dedicated people like yourself?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic observation. I think you're certainly correct, right? There's there's definitely a balance, right, between recognizing that these are structural issues, but we also have to recognize that we hold a lot of power, right? I think when we're thinking about Islamophobia being such a huge structural issue, I think thinking about how our homes are structured is also very important, right? Our homes often become spaces, hopefully, where Muslim students are able to build themselves up, right? Where there are those counter narratives. So we need to be open about talking about issues within our homes. We need to be creating spaces where young people can come to us and say, hey, this happened at school. What do you think about this? Or, and we also need to be affirming Muslim identity because right now, yes, IHM, October is coming up, and often that is a month that, we celebrate Muslim identity, legacies, histories. But what about the rest of the school year, right? And so I think our homes become a really key part in that puzzle. It's critical, like you mentioned. I also think building relationships and connecting with other communities, like you alluded to, right, becomes extremely important because Islamophobia is just not a Muslim problem, right? It's a problem that impacts the fabric of what it means to be an inclusive society, right? So just like any form of hate, we need to be engaged and active within our communities. Starting with our neighbors is a beautiful example that you provided, right? And I think by beginning from our own homes, we'll begin to see that ripple effect, right? Because some people share, this problem's too big for me. What am I going to do, right? And I remind folks that, yes, you can start from your own homes. If it's an educator, I say you can start from your classrooms. There are so many ways that we can begin to impact change. And we all have a part to play in it.
I always remember when you mentioned, what can I do? I always remember with in dear memories, when I was younger, I heard Dale Carnegie's mention of how he walked on a beach one day and saw this kid throwing starfishes back into the ocean or into the sea, into the water. And there was obviously hundreds of them because they'd come up with the tide. And he said, what are you doing? And the little boy said, well, I'm throwing this starfish back into the water. He said, but that's only one fish. And the kid said something that the author said changed his life. He said, I am doing my bit.
Right.
I sometimes almost think we all, a million of us, can do so much if we affected 1 million more Canadians.
Yes.
That's 2 million people. And when you use the term of 46% people that are Islamophobic, I was thinking, I like to look at the half full. And that means 54% are not Islamophobic. So why wouldn't now we work? Because remember, in the Islamic narrative, in Mecca, there were opponents, but there were also friendly non-Muslims. Abu Talib is one of them. And he nurtured the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Muhammad, peace be upon him, our CEO or Chief Executive Officer, for almost 40 years. And so, therefore, the narrative is there. We had many friendly non-Muslims. The history is full of them. And we have seen people that have accommodated. And let's face it, in my, at least my personal experience, I found more friendly neighbors, more friendly co-workers, more friendly shoppers, people particularly who almost look like they're saying, why don't you inform us? I remember somebody coming in our mosque after the Quebec events, particularly. There was a couple of women. They were crying. They said, we had no idea somebody who claims to represent us could do something like this. This is not us at all. It just, it's obviously a very emotional moment for everybody. But I still think, Sister Aasiyah, those moments, I don't like to use the word we should, kind of cash in on these things. That's not a nice term. But for want of a better word, these opportunities are sometimes lost in the, what I say, the temporary rise and fall of a desire to do something. You said IHM, Islamic History Month. I think it's an opportunity which is every year. Okay, it's only 1 month. But sometimes, I look at it like Ramadan. Ramadan, after all, that month of discipline, as I call it, is meant to prepare us for the rest of the year. Why can't we use that narrative to say, you know what, 1 month is enough for us to start. 1 month is what we need to make our neighbors come and see what we're getting up to. It's also, I personally think, I learned so much from the month itself when I realized, you know what, Islam has a rich history, cultural history, really history of science. It has built around things like cleanliness, for example. I used to love to tell our neighbors, we have a history of staying, particularly during COVID.
Yeah.
I used to say, you know what? Five
Yeah.
times a day, there's no community that comes close to cleanliness when it comes to prevention against COVID.
Yeah.
No community comes close to being physically active. Look, if you're going down 5 times a day and putting your head on the ground, you are exercising, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
So I use those terms just because I think sometimes we get lost too much in the what the other side is saying, but we don't claim the seat to say, guys, we are proactive people.
Yes.
We have a lot to offer. We are the cleanest. We are the most law-abiding citizen, law-abiding community amongst them. Okay, I shouldn't say the most, but we are amongst the most law-abiding people. We pay our taxes. We keep our cities, keep our spaces where we stay clean. We're not violent people. There's really no history of violence in any workspace committed by Muslims. Why are we so shy of sharing these simple things with our neighbors, with people that work with us? The same applies to the students. I think the opportunities occur pretty much, because there are students. I remember one young Muslim sister who presented this thing to her entire school on hijab. I mean, hats off to her for doing something in front of 400 or 500 students. That's not everybody's cup of tea.
Yeah.
But you know what, Sister Aasiyah, it showed me it's possible.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's possible. And if it's possible for her, it must be possible for others. I still remember our sister, forgetting her name, she's now presenting on Muslim TV in Canada. She was also used to be the head of Islam. Her name is just Catherine Bullock. I think that's the name I'm trying to remember. So she wrote this thesis on hijab. So I said, you know what? This work is master. I read it many years ago. I've not remembered all of it.
Right.
But what I'm trying to say is there's enough for us to talk about.
Yes.
There's, like you said, Islamic History Month. There is the performance of Muslims in Canada. There's the completely hate-free history of Muslims, 99.99% of them.
Yeah.
There is an excellent record of Muslim members of parliament in Canadian Parliament. There are Muslim mayors.
Yeah.
There are Muslims who established the first mosques in Edmonton. So there is so much there.
Yeah.
I know I'm a little emotional around this topic, but I just think Muslims really have to take this bull by the horn and not let others decide which direction they want to take this narrative in. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I love that the examples that you shared. I think we have to play more of a proactive role. We're very reactive at the moment, and that could be because of fear, because of worry. Like even when we're thinking about hate crimes, for example, 2/3 go unreported, right? So there's many reasons why folks might not be as inactive, but I really do think it's important for us to take more of a proactive stance. Use opportunities as teachable moments, right? IHM, like you said, is a great way to propel a school or a classroom into ongoing learning, right, throughout the rest of the year. I think there's so many opportunities for us to think, beyond even just the scope of Islamophobia, right, beyond this kind of oppression lens, but think beyond that and think about legacy, think about histories, think about celebration. I think it was about a few years ago I learned that, there's when you think about even just the canon of medicine, right? Think about Ibn Sina, think about, Ibn
Battuta.
Yeah, and there's just such a beautiful legacy.
Zahabi, yeah.
And I don't mean to, frame this as something in the past, but there's so much excellence around us even now. So I think it's about recognizing that even our tradition is imbued with ihsan, with excellence, right? And so why shy away from sharing that with others? It also reminds me of a teaching of the Prophet ﷺ where he mentions that even if it's the Day of Judgment, right, and you have a sapling in your hand, plant it, right? And so do whatever you can, no matter how things are looking, right? Do what you can, because we all can do something. So I think it's really important for us as a community to come together and think about what does this mean for us? And how can we organize around it strategically?
Yeah. Excellent. I think we have a couple of questions which our producer Kashif pointed to me. Kashif, if you have any questions for Sister Aasiyah or myself, please go ahead.
Yes, Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much for this conversation. So one, and maybe this will be a lead way into the next topic about changing the narrative. One of the questions I sort of discussing this stream with some of my friends and family, one concern that parents have is there's a lot of things that are truth for us, are true in our religion, but they're very potentially dangerous things to talk about in schools and stuff. So they sort of instruct their kids to stay away from this. There's numerous topics, but maybe as examples like LGBT, the whole Palestine issue. So the parents are actually fearful and they tell their children, don't talk about these things in school.
Yeah.
Like they're concerned for their safety. But is that the right approach? And like what really should students and parents be doing when it comes to these difficult conversations that the rest of society might not agree with, but they're part of our truth, like they're haq according to the Quran, and the way we treat other, look at humanity and so forth.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I think, yeah, like you said, there are a number of issues that, from what we believe to be truth can be contentious or could be challenging to bring up. I know many parents often hesitate to bring issues up. I will say that there are a number of mechanisms that you can utilize, right? So depending on the issue, and everything's done in a case-by-case basis, but I encourage you to kind of be really aware and proactive of the policies in your school, right? Because when we're thinking about even just human rights legislation, religion is a protected ground, right? And so how do we understand that better to be able to ensure that we can fully participate in our school environment as Muslims? So, I would encourage folks to become a little bit more aware, if possible. Think closely about the policies and practices at the school, and also be aware of, mechanisms to address issues, right? So sometimes if it's a classroom issue, how do you go about doing that? What's the best way to engage with an educator? If it's something that's, more systemic, if it's school-wide, what are the tools at your disposal, right? So just kind of being aware of that is really, really important when we're thinking about how do we effectively, advocate for issues that are important for us. And like I said, NCCM is very active in these spaces. So, I'll definitely share my email. You can definitely reach out to me if there's something specific that we could support with. But it's a very important question. But I think being proactive, being able to identify what are your tools is really important in that space. And also recognizing that being Muslim and practicing your faith is, it's part of our landscape in Canada, right? It's a protected ground. So just being mindful of these pieces is important.
Jazakallah khair, Sister Aasiyah. But one of the things that, because we've had these questions asked as well, and just like a question when it's put up by a non-specialist to a specialist, I usually try and say, look, if this question demands a serious answer, then serious, educated people ought to be answering this question. This should not be a playground conversation. This should not be a conversation. I'll give you a small example. When I used to work in a health space many years ago, there's somebody who asked me as we were walking, do you believe in God? I said, is this a serious question or is this an unserious question? Because look, if you asked me if I was sick or well, I wouldn't take that matter lightly. So if this question is serious, then we must find the space and the time to talk about it.
Yes.
It can't be a corridor conversation while you're walking away from me.
Right.
That indicates to me you're not really seriously interested in the answer. Just like the question that Brother Kashif brought up, whether it's the LGBT question or the Palestine question, these are not questions that I expect children to answer. I don't expect them to be experts on this. So to go quiet and to say, well, we don't want to talk about it, I think would engender more animosity potentially. I think the way I would deal with this is that I've dealt with before. Say, please ask if there's a school question, if there's a teacher question, where is this question coming from? Because if it's coming from an authoritative figure, then it's got to be dealt with in an authoritative manner. If it's coming from a child who's just interested in making a prank and make you feel bad, this is something you have to have a strategy, because this is not what's going to finish. It could be, these are terrorists. So, you've got that, what do you call that hijab? There's some ninjas, there's some interesting terms I've heard. And I remember somebody saying, were you released from the old age pension home early? I said, well, they release jailbirds once in a while. Why wouldn't they release old age pensioners? It was just a term to kind of lighten the matter, to say, don't take everything so seriously. Recognize some people are doing this simply to make you feel bad. They have nothing good. They have, unfortunately, some very challenging situations at home. Sometimes they are other situations where people have felt stress in their life, and they feel this is their way to offload what they're feeling to make you feel bad, or to make you feel like, oh, you are the one who has to answer this. But I simply say, is this an authority question? Meaning, is it coming from a specialist, or is it coming from somebody who's just interested in the answer to make you feel bad? Because both situations cannot be dealt with the same.
Yes.
So that would be my way of dealing with it. But I appreciate your answer. Let's have another question, Brother Kashif.
Jazakallah khair. So this one came in from the stream. I'm displaying it on the screen there, Dr. Atil, if you want to read it out.
So do you have any insight? The question is to Sister Aasiyah. Do you have any insight about how we can find out about student rights, how students' rights? How can we speak up about our discomforts, and what to do when we face pushback? Would you be
That's a
giving
great
us
question.
an insight on that, Sister
Yes,
Aasiyah?
I feel like this question encompasses our session really nicely.
Yes, it really does.
I think in terms of recognizing student rights, I will say NCCM has a really great guide. It's available on our website. I can even share hard copies with the mosque, inshallah. But it looks at different spaces where you can exercise your rights, because sometimes we don't even know we have rights in certain spaces, right? I hear from parents sometimes in the community where they, especially newcomer parents, one parent came to me and said, I didn't even know I could ask for an accommodation on Jummah for my child. And I said, yes, you can, right? So there's so many spaces where we do have rights, right? So when it comes to requesting prayer time, time to go for Hajj, right? If you need to have, change your schedule a little bit, requests for Ramadan accommodations. These are all well within your rights, right? And when we're thinking about religious accommodations, I'm not a lawyer, so this is not legal advice, but it is your right to request an accommodation. Every school has a policy around religious accommodations. So I encourage you to exercise that right. If a school, for whatever reason, denies your request, there's a very high test for that to be valid. They have to prove undue hardship. And that's actually very difficult to do within a school setting. So I encourage you to use the means that are available to you, because students do have these rights, and sometimes we're not aware of them. And so when we're not aware, it becomes very easy for folks to trample over our rights. And so being aware of them is the first step. In terms of the discomfort, I know, if we're thinking about the education system and it's set up in a particular way, it does privilege a particular type of student, right? So like I said, there's Muslim students who don't necessarily feel like they can be fully Muslim in this space, right? And so there is that discomfort then in being able to express that, I do need a prayer space, or, I need an accommodation from this class because of this topic that's being taught. So I need I need an alternative curriculum. So there is that discomfort, but I think it also connects with what we were talking about in terms of like our home environments, right? Build an environment in your home, cultivate an environment where we celebrate Muslim excellence, where we affirm Muslim identity. So our children are better equipped when they go into the world to be able to challenge these ideas, because the reality is, Islamophobia is prevalent. If we like to talk about it or not, it's a truth. But there's also the truth that we have a lot of power in our homes, right? And so I encourage us to build up our children, our young people, in a way where they feel like they have the tools necessary to be able to engage actively, and rather than shy away, right? And there's so many ways to engage. It might be through these policies and practices. It might be even doing, like a presentation. It could be even...
I also found very interesting, Sister Aasiyah, the parent-teacher meetings that took place.
Yeah.
I know my wife had a lot to say and share, and teachers often welcomed the opportunity to learn.
Yeah.
They use the term culture. I always used to term the way of life. But I had no problem with somebody wants to use the term culture, so be it. But I found universality in people's enthusiasm about learning other cultures. Frankly, many people have no idea where to go to find this information. I know our local political parties, they welcome the opportunity to come to the mosque. Every time there's been an election, we've invited them, not to speak, but just to come and sit down with us and kind of look. And they often welcome to say, well, what goes on inside the mosques? What is actually taking place? How are these children being educated? What are they being educated about? I think that's genuine enthusiasm. I think there's a genuine interest in finding more about the other, because I don't think necessarily, and I'm talking about more the 54% Canadians who are not Islamophobic, we can assume that they are genuinely, and I know from personal experience that they are interested in finding out, well, who are these people who come. Then I'll give you a small example. In Newcastle, very close to where I live, the local church members actually got in contact with the Muslims during Ramadan time and kind of proposed to say, you can use this church for your evening prayers. And they found out, oh, there's a Friday afternoon prayer also. And said that, the church was being underutilized, etc. But it was purely their initiative.
Right.
They actually called and said, we would like this space to be used for, we know that you'll be doing, remembrance of God, etc. But I was just thinking, where did this come from? Except a genuine desire to really make our neighbors feel welcome, because they notice the numbers have increased, the goods in the grocery store seem to be changing. There are more women with hijab on in Walmart, etc.
Yes.
And so it is inevitable that the local population has noticed. And I think that's, Sister Aasiyah, the time for us, particularly in new spaces, in new communities, to use this opportunity to not just become familiar with the services, but also to make people feel like, hey, we're new. We want to make sure you know who we are. Like we often share organic garden produce with our neighbors. Every year at the end of summer, we share it. When Eid time comes by, we go around with some sweets. We give them a little card. And yes, we also share things when other celebrations come along in a more, happy holidays time terms, this kind of thing. So I think those small gestures go a very long way in people feeling that there is so much more. And I think this sister or brother who's asked this question will probably themselves feel empowered when they realize that actually neighbors are smiling at us. We're smiling back at them. I walk with my almost 90-year-old mother in the neighborhood every evening in the summer, obviously. And I cannot tell you the number of people that have actually gotten to know me because of just that simple thing. It's a very simple thing, because people don't no longer have familiarity with an elderly parent in a house and a younger than inverted commas term, walking, or your son mowing your neighbor's lawn, or cleaning their snow. I think there are so many opportunities that just go unchecked. We're always looking for some academic answers, but there are so many simple, everyday, get to know your neighbor answers, and people enjoy it. Why not invite them to next masjid barbecue? Why not? In Ramadan, you know what we did? We invited people to share iftar. Our neighbors come and share our iftar. Food is a very common factor.
Good,
I didn't realize how many samosas would be eaten that day. They were all wiped out. So I really think people have to come out of these scared and narratives and really thinking like you're in some enemy. You're not. You're living in one of the friendliest countries in the world.
Yes.
I don't see why people forget. I think a lot of it, Sister Aasiyah, also goes, we have not really studied the history, the landscape, the people, the background, the ethnicities, and all that has gone on in making this country what it is. It's a country of immigrants.
Yes.
I don't see why we should suddenly feel so strange about saying, hey, we're the newest kid on the block. We have so much to share.
Yeah.
We have, like I was saying earlier, I don't want to repeat myself, but we have some very healthy eating practices. There are exceptions, of course. But really disciplined activity, like look at how fasting has come big time into this general space. Intermittent fasting is now something that's being popularized. So why not use these terms to make people feel at ease, to say it's a good thing. It's a good thing to get up early, Fajr, right? It's a good thing. You sync with the outside, you make a better day. You smile more. You're going to be less likely to be depressed. We don't drink alcohol. There's no risk of people having to have increased police presence on Eid day. No need for it. So why don't we share these simple things that will really make, I think, the whole thing that bit much easier. I know I have a different narrative, but I like to talk about something that looks easy, not difficult.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. I think
your addition, of course, is massively
speaking
helpful.
to like the Muslim way of life, right? And kind of even just the everyday actions, how they can be made beautiful by inviting folks to them, right? And it makes it very simple that way. I like that.
Do you have anything, you were talking about some resources that are available for those who want to perhaps read off. Is there a website they can go to? Brother Kashif, have we shown the audience the website of National Council of Canadian Muslims? Okay, Jazakallah khair.
Yes.
Thank you.
So feel free to visit the website, nccm.ca. There's a number of different resources you can access. So we have resources for post-secondary students. So if you want to learn your rights on campus, we have a high school town hall where we engaged with Muslim high school students and learned about their experiences, what's working, what isn't working. We also have a Know Your Rights guide for everyday experiences. So accessing like healthcare at the airport, just day-to-day life, and what your rights are. So feel free to have a look at that. And of course, you can also reach out to us if you think your child's school would benefit from being connected to NCCM in any way. It could be through training, it could even be through consultation. And if you as a parent or even as a student who's watching are in need of any support in terms of advocacy or even just knowing what your rights are in a situation, you can definitely reach out to us. You can reach out to me specifically. My email is acon@nccm.ca.
Excellent.
Awesome.
It's been such a useful and a very enthusiastic session for me. I've learned quite a
Likewise.
lot. And I really appreciate your coming and helping us with this topic that I think for a lot of people is very stressful. But I do feel it's added on by, I think, perhaps making a mountain out of a molehill. I think the media have a way of making things really blow things out of proportion. We start looking at statistics, we start looking at what happened bad. And I keep reminding people, out of what bad incidents, how many thousands of good incidents have taken place? How many times have you been in the grocery store and people have smiled at you? How many times have you smiled and said, how are you? How was your day? Just making common, what I call maybe almost like it's a routine conversation. I think it goes a long way, because if this is about a school, there's got to be people that are in the same school from the same area. Why not make friends with people? Why not invite them to have something common? Like I mentioned, one of them is definitely Islamic Heritage Month. It could also be a Eid gathering, to say we're having an Eid gathering. We have a, we had a carnival yesterday somewhere. I can't remember where it was. It was one of the local mosques. Having a carnival, inviting your neighbors to it. Just taking down those barriers, which I think people feel so strongly about. I think some of this is coming from the fear of being in a new place. And although I don't know and I don't want to comment on how long the person who's asked this question has lived in Canada, but I think people who've lived in Canada for 10 years plus will find more happy incidents, many, many more nice events, and take part, like we take part as a, as an organization in the Canada Day, opportunities where people are present, like the Terry Walker Run. There's so many little activities where people can almost feel. I tell you a funny incident as we're ending this videocast, that we had invited our mayor into one of our new mosques, which had basically been a church, but was bought by a organization. And when these 5-year-old kids, when the mayor came to speak in a Jummah gathering, he said, "Did you know that you only believe in one God?" I still remember the whole audience wasn't quite sure what to say. And the mayor laughed. He said, "Thank you so much for telling me. I also do." And I'm just saying, Sister Aasiyah, sometimes it's little simple incidents like that will really break the ice and will let people see we're at the end of the day all in the same thing. Hasn't COVID proven that in a big way? We are all in this together. We need to take care of each other. We need to be careful about how the other person is. We also need to protect this environment. We need to make this country a safe country to live in. I think if we work on those themes and we deal with these aspects, as you've mentioned, and use, of course, services of the NCCM, I think we can still build a beautiful and a wonderful environment for all to live in. I thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I appreciate your coming and helping us with this topic. And I hope, inshallah, we can engage you again if we do need to involve. And I think your email is there for others if they want to aid you. Once again, Jazakallah khair. This is Zehan Rashid. Yes, I forgot to mention, Jazakallah khair for reminding, these videocasts are now going to be a regular event for the next month or so. So our next videocast will be on September 4, where we'll talk about habits of effective Muslim students. We'll have a videocast on September 11, where our esteemed guest and principal of a Toronto school, Brother Omar Zia, will come on. And then we have Imam Hamid Salimi coming on September 25th, which will also engage same topic. So please watch out for this space, inshallah, Sunday morning, 11 o'clock. This is Zehan Rashid signing off for Happy Strong Family. Thank you so much for attending.